Today, we will be comparing the Sony A6700 to the Sony A7C. Functionally, the A6700 has a feature set the A7C does not have, but there are benefits to the A7C that the A67 just cannot live up to. Either way, that could be the deciding factor on which one of these two cameras you decide to spend your hard-earned money on. The goal of this video is to get to the bottom of what you are looking for while you're searching for a camera. If we compare the number of upgrades the A6700 has to the A6000 series lineup of APS-C cameras to the number of upgrades the A7C has to the A7 III, it's pretty significant. With that said, some of those upgrades may not fit the bill for what you need it for. The A6700 has a 26 megapixel APS-C BSI CMOS sensor that can shoot in 4K up to 60 with no crop, or 4K 120 with the heavy crop. It can also shoot in 1080 up to 240, and it can shoot in 422 10-bit. The A7C has a 24 megapixel full-frame sensor and can shoot in 4K up to 30 and 1080 up to 120, and can shoot in 420 8-bit internally and 422 10-bit when you record externally. Before we jump into any conclusions on the frame rates and resolutions, coincidentally, the 1080p footage out of the A6700 is quite a bit softer than the A7C's 1080 footage, and the A6700 has quite a bit of quality fall off. There are still many 1080 shooters out there who may be fine with the smaller file size and easier workflow when they're editing in post-production. I shot a lot of professional client work videos with the A7 III for over 2 years, which is essentially a larger A7C, all in 4K 24 for the headshots and 1080 60 for the slow-mo B-roll. And then I would just upscale the 1080 footage up to 4K in post to match that 4K 24. Not once has anyone ever said to me, I wish your shots were a little bit sharper and had better resolution. And with a platform like YouTube, the images are compressed anyways. I'm not saying that 8-bit is as good as 10-bit by any means, but I'm also saying it shouldn't be a deal breaker for someone who wants a camera that performs really well in low light, like the A7C, and has better 1080p resolution.
Look at the A7C.
The A7C has great low light performance because of its full frame sensor, which also comes with a higher lens cost compared to the A6700's APS-C sensor, which is the same as the Sony FX30. It's going to be cheaper when you go to buy lenses. This video test shows the difference when I shoot in higher ISO ranges in low light environments. This may be a deal breaker for those of you who want to use your cameras in low light situations such as weddings or nature videography or shooting portraits in the golden hour. This will also vary on the lenses that you're using with higher apertures. You can use full frame lenses on the A6700, and you can also use APS-C lenses on the A7C with its APS-C crop mode. You can see why this is going to be a hard camera comparison video to make. That's what we're covering today on the Film Alliance. Today I'll be speaking about both the photography and the video capabilities of both of these cameras and showing you a plethora of video and photography comparisons. But so you know, I'm a video creator, so I come at this comparison with a video first context. The full frame lenses I used for both cameras is the Zeiss 35mm f1.4, and the three APS-C lenses that I used were the wide-angle Viltrox 13mm f1.4, the Sony Telephoto 55-210 f4.5 to 6.3, and the Sony kit lens the 16-50 f3.5 to 5.6. I theorized that Sony was trying to move people from APS-C to full frame with the release of the ZV-E1. But when they released the A6700, it made me think, maybe they're not. Before we get into the details of all the specs and the weeds on the differences, let's jump into the similarities so we have a good baseline to start. There's a lot of them. Are you ready? Let's go. Both cameras are hybrid with 2.36 million dot electronic viewfinders, have similar body types and weights. Both have 3-inch articulating touchscreens, both have mic ports, headphone jacks, USB-C, micro HDMI, one SD card slot with side loading. Neither have internal fans. Both can record gyroscopic data, take the same batteries and SD cards. They both have the quarter mount thread centered right underneath the lens mount. Both have intelligent hot shoes, our Sony E-mount. They both have IBIS. Both rangefinder style cameras, are constructed with magnesium alloy, and both have Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, and both have 14 stops of dynamic range and can shoot JPEG and RAW photos. I like to start with the outside of the camera body before we jump into some of the features that are in the heart of the cameras. When you put the battery and the media into both cameras, the A6700 weighs 493 grams and the A7C weighs 509 grams. That's pretty remarkable that a full-frame camera is that close in weight to an APS-C camera, where historically, before we got the ZV-E1, full-frame cameras were always much larger. But size and weight of the camera body and lenses truly matter a lot, especially if you're a traveler. And if you go with bigger full-frame camera with bigger full-frame lenses, you're going to have a consistent issue, compared to if you have a smaller form factor, not only body, but also APS-C lens lens lineup. Both cameras are made of magnesium alloy, and the hand grip on the A6700 is a lot deeper and robust than the A7C. I much prefer these bigger grips because it'll prevent that accidental drop now and again. I've never dropped the A7S III, but I have dropped my ZV-E10 until I purchased a cage for it, which gave me way better grip. Both cameras are minimalistic in form factor and great for travel and being able to slip them right into your pocket or throw them onto a gimbal if you want to get some of those cinematic type shots. In terms of portability, it really is a toss-up if you plan to do a run and gun 1 minute and next you're vlogging with it. The only thing that I would consider is full frame lenses are going to be a lot bigger and heavier than an APS-C lens that you could get for the A6700. As I mentioned earlier, the A6700 and the A7C both have 2.36 million dot electronic viewfinders, but what really matters is the magnification, and for the A6700 it has a 1.07 times magnification, whereas the A7C has a 0.59 times magnification, which makes the A6700's EVF better for detailed focus. This is especially helpful for portraits, wildlife, and macro videography. Once you use the A6700 for a while and then you jump into the A7C, you would clearly notice a difference. If you're a glasses wearer, you would not be able to see the edges of the frame on the A7C, whereas you'd be able to see it better with the A6700. That's just something to think about. The screen on the A6700 has 1.03 million dots and the A7C has 921,000. This doesn't seem like much of a difference, and I didn't notice that much of a difference, but both screens are fully articulating, which makes it really nice for people who film themselves like I do right now. I used to have to use the A7 III for all of my headshot filming and I could never see myself, so I kind of just guessed. So the fact that the A7C has a fully articulating screen is a huge upgrade from the A7 III. Here at the Film Alliance, I think we can all agree that one of the hardest parts about creating a video is finding the right music that perfectly complements the story you are trying to tell. You want it to be perfect, and you want it to carry the viewer seamlessly through the end of the video. Track Club allows you to do this by being able to infinitely customize the stems of any song, muting or soloing instruments, adjusting volume levels, and speeding up or slowing the BPM to match the energy of the video. It gives you a greater level of creative control over your sound, all without leaving your browser. The first step in my creative process is deciding what filters match the vibe I'm going for or a particular part of a video. I've been able to take my videos to a whole new level since I started using Track Club. Try it out for yourself. I'll leave a link in the description for a free, full access 2-month trial. Now back to our video. Both cameras have the same ports and a single SD card slot. I'd really appreciate that dual card slot that we got with the FX30 on both of these cameras so we could do some more professional type of work. But these cameras were not created for professional work, so I guess we'll just have to stick to the single slot. Also, that micro HDMI port could really pose a problem to those of you who want to record externally, but also for those of you who are using a monitor just to monitor your footage. The micro HDMI on my A7 III became loose over time, and whenever I had the HDMI wire hooked up to the side of the A7 III to an external monitor, whenever I even just touched the wire, the monitor would go black for 2 or 3 seconds, and sometimes I would have to unplug it and plug it back in. So the micro HDMI ports do pose a little bit of a problem, but for those of you who are not using it for any type of professional work and just using it as a reference, maybe in a studio setting, I wouldn't be too worried about it. With that said, one of the benefits of having a micro HDMI, especially at the bottom of the camera, is when you fully articulate your screen out, the wire won't be blocking the screen like it does with my A7S III. The A6700 has more buttons and dials, which means you can customize it to your liking and quickly toggle between settings a lot easier than with the A7C. This is a subjective category because some people like the minimum amount of buttons on the outside of their cameras and just like to pull out their camera and start shooting, where others like to have more buttons for more customization. I prefer to have more buttons for the type of content that I create. I don't have time to go searching through quick menus or function dashboards to change something. I like to have a button or dial on the outside of the camera that I can physically adjust or develop muscle memory for that. One of the main dials the A6700 has that the A7C does not have is a little front dial that you can easily turn. I set this thing up to be my aperture, and it's been super helpful as long as I'm using a lens that has that functionality. The A6700 has a mode dial where you can quickly switch between videos and photos and S&Q mode without having to dive into your menu system. Also, whenever you switch between these modes, the exposure settings that you had preset will stay the same, so you don't have to reset your exposure every single time you want to jump from one of these modes to another. So the A6700 definitely wins when it comes to dials and buttons. Did I mention the A6700 has 2 custom buttons? Both cameras have the same battery type and last for the same amount of time, give or take a few minutes. The bigger battery that the A6700 takes is a huge upgrade from previous APS-C cameras that we got with Sony, who got that same battery that the ZV-10 got, which lasts about an hour. I I know we already talked about frame rates and resolutions for both of these cameras, but one thing that I wanted to mention is that both cameras have great dynamic range thanks to the full sensor width that oversamples from 6K. They both have a highly detailed 4K image without any pixel binning. You also have the option of shooting in Super 35 crop mode on the A7C, which not only gives you a variety of framing choices, but also the option to use APS-C lenses that were actually designed for APS-C cameras without having any vignetting issues. With that said, there is a bit of an image quality loss when you use Super 35 mode on your A7C. There's also a mild crop when shooting in 4K 30 on the A7C, but it's so insignificant that I didn't even notice it, mainly because I shoot most of my video in 4K 24. In my video tests, I was seeing that I was getting a little bit softer of an image out of the A7C in Super 35 crop mode over the A6700, which does not have Super 35 crop mode because it doesn't need it. This makes sense because if we're only using a portion of the A7C sensor while we're in Super 35 crop mode, our image won't be as sharp as the A6700. When I shot with both cameras in 1080-120, I did notice that the A67 was a bit softer than the A7C. Both cameras are advertised to have 14 stops of dynamic range, and this makes sense because the A6700 has the same sensor as the FX30, and the A7C has the same sensor as the A7 III. Just remember that the A6700 can shoot in 422 10-bit, whereas the A7C can shoot in 420 8-bit when recording internally. Also, something to consider when shooting in 422 10-bit is make sure that your computer can handle those file sizes before you jump into something like the A6700 or one of these full-frame cameras that can shoot in 422 10-bit. Another big advantage the A6700 has over the A7C is the AI processing unit, which provides the A6700 with better autofocusing systems for a wider variety of subjects. You can focus on trains, planes, animals, and Sony claims that the A6700 has 60% better performance when shooting humans, and 40% better when shooting animals, which happens to be the case. Which is kind of ironic because Sony already is so ahead of the game in autofocus when it comes to all of their competitors in the camera market. To think that they even upped their autofocus game is pretty mind-boggling. On top of the AI processing unit, the A6700 has 759 autofocus points, which is a big difference from the A7C, which only has 693 autofocus points. The A6700 is just simply faster at focusing and more reliable. If you're buying a camera for its autofocus capabilities, then go with the A6700. The A6700 has focus mapping and focus peaking for an easier focus experience, whereas the A7C only has focus peaking like all of the old previous Sony cameras. If you're wondering what focus mapping is, when you're using it, the areas that are in focus and areas that are out of focus are displayed so that you can visually distinguish between both of them. Areas behind the in-focus region are indicated by dots in a cooler color, and those in the front of the in-focus region are indicated by dots in a warm color. It does work in manual focus, but only on lenses that can communicate with Sony camera software about their focus state. So only for lenses that are autofocus that you can manually switch into manual focus. You cannot use focus mapping for full manual focus lenses from third-party companies like the 7 Artisans Cine lens. You'd have to use focus peaking. If you're wondering what that is, it can determine the sharpness of an image by its contrasty edges. With that new AI processing unit with the A6700, we got all of those cool features like auto reframing. I don't know if this has anything to do with the AI processing unit, but you can also internally record time-lapse with the A6700, whereas the A7C, you have to do it through interval shooting function within the menu system. Then you have to take all of those photos into post-production and seam them together to make your time-lapse video. The A6700 exports a full 422 10-bit video file in S-Log3 if you want to grade it yourself in post, which makes it super helpful for those of you who like to set it and forget it. The A6700 also has a self-timer for people who like that buffer between takes for video. The A7C has a photography timer, but it's not for video. The A6700 has that new user interface we've been getting with all of the latest Sony cameras and that AI processing chip, whereas the A7C has that older UI, which I became very familiar with over the years. But the new menu system is now growing on me. It just seems to be a little bit more easier on the workflow and easier to navigate. Also, you can adjust your exposure settings on the display of the A6700 and swipe up and left to access those quick menu bars and the function menu, where the A7C has minimal control like touch autofocus. The A6700 has a second menu system, which makes it a lot easier and quicker to navigate for that faster workflow. The A6700's burst rate is 11 frames per second, and the A7C has a 10 frames per second burst rate. Both cameras can shoot in JPEG and RAW, and the A6700 can shoot in lossless compressed RAW and the HEIF format. If you're curious as to what that is, when the camera records images in the HEIF format, they have that same image quality as JPEG images, but require a smaller file size since the HEIF compression efficiency is about twice higher than the JPEG. As a result, the camera can save and transmit data very efficiently. With APS-C cameras, you get that extra 1.5 times reach, which is great for sports and wildlife photography, and the lens options will not be as expensive. But because the A6700 is APS-C, you will have a shallower depth of field with the A7C over the A6700. Also, that clear image zoom that you get out of the A6700 will give you that much further of a reach without recreating the pixels. The max mechanical shutter on both cameras is 1/4000 and 1/8000 when you throw it into silent mode or electronic shutter, which is one full stop of light. Unlike a mechanical shutter, an electronic shutter doesn't have any moving parts, so the image information that is captured by the sensor can be much shorter. When shooting photography, I prefer mechanical shutter because it doesn't capture those weird light frequencies as much as the electronic shutter does. Also, mechanical shutter prevents rolling shutter like we get with electronic shutter. Rolling shutter doesn't only affect video, but also stills. The A6700 has breathing compensation, but you can only use this function with lenses that support it. You don't have to worry about lenses that support breathing compensation with the A7C because it doesn't have it. Breathing compensation electronically changes the size of the frame by applying a specified percentage of the crop to reduce lens breathing while altering the focus. It makes your footage look a little bit more professional than amateur. With that said, I find it more helpful just to throw the camera into manual focus and to manually focus if you don't want to have any of that focus pumping. Both cameras have sensor shift 5-axis stabilization, but the A6700's AI processing unit also improves the communication between the body and the lens, providing a more stable framing to minimize shake. But don't forget the A6700 has a 1.5 times crop already, and the wider lenses that you use, the smoother footage you will get. But neither camera has dynamic stabilization that we saw with the ZV-E1, which is truly incredible. Both cameras can record gyro data inside of the camera, which you can put through Sony's Catalyst Browse software and smooth out your footage for even more gimbal-like footage. I don't use Catalyst Browse because it's an extra step in my workflow, and for some reason it seems to take forever for me to export it. I would recommend, however, picking up a gimbal instead and just getting your shots right in camera. Now, one reason I would use Catalyst Browse is to remove that awful rolling shutter the electronic shutter produces when filming video. In my test, the A6700 performed a bit better than the A7C in rolling shutter tests, but way better than the little ZV-E10. If you're a vlogger, you may want to nab that A7C with a wide lens for great framing, or you could get an ultra-wide lens for the A6700. It depends on the frame that you would like and what lenses you have or planning on purchasing. But if you did go with the A7C and you had a full frame lens on the end of it, it'd be a lot heavier for your arm, especially if you were doing a full day of vlogging. The A6700 has all of the picture profiles, plus S-Cinetone, and the ability to upload your own custom LUTs. I actually used this function with the FX30 and it made it super easy for me to expose everything right in camera rather than guessing, especially when I'm shooting in log profiles. The A7C is 8-bit, so I don't ever shoot in S-Log3 or S-Log2 because the image really starts to fall apart when you push and pull a lot of the colors in post-production, especially the darks. For the A7C, it has the standard 1 through 10 profiles, and I find it easiest to shoot in Cine 2 for some low-key grading in post. The A6700 has a newly designed built-in microphone with 2 holes on the front of it, which would theoretically make it have better sounding native audio than the A7C, because the A7C does not have any holes on the front of the body for better audio, but you can be the judge on which one you think sounds better straight out of camera. The A7C, oh yeah, I have it in full program auto. This is what your A7C will look like in APS-C mode with an APS-C lens like this one. All right, now let's go check out the A6700. Okay, so here we are with the A6700. Again, I really want to test out that audio. We're outside, it's windy, and I don't have any external mics set up on this camera. I have the exposure set to program auto because of all the changing light. And it's really crazy what happens with your exposure when you just let it go wild. That's why you want to be in control of it. All right, so there's your audio and your vlog test for both of these cameras. For better audio on both cameras, they both have intelligent hot shoes where you can hook up a Sony mic like the ECM M1, which connects to the camera through the hot shoe and records way cleaner audio without any external wires having to go into the mic port on the side of the camera. The A6700's ISO sensitivity is 100 to 32,000, and the A7C is 100 to 51,200. The A6700's sensor is a sensor out of the FX30, which has a dual base ISO of 800 and 2500. The A7C's native ISO is 100. The native ISO is where the camera's sensor performs the best, with the least amount of signal to noise ratio. I shoot everything in my base ISOs, or at least I try to, and then I just use an ND filter to stop down. In these tests, I tested a variety of ISO ranges to see when both cameras' images started to fall apart. Both cameras allow you to stream straight from the USB-C cable in 4K 30. The USB powers the camera at the same time with no overheating, although you can't do any picture profiles like S-Log3, you just have to shoot whatever straight out of camera. To use this feature, you have to activate the USB streaming in the user menu and connect your camera over the USB-C port with your computer. For the A7C, I don't like that you don't get 4K 60, and also I noticed that the 1080 footage was a little bit worse, especially in Super 35 crop mode. Also, I noticed that when I'm using auto white balance, especially in artificial lighting environments, I see a lot of pink and magenta tint. Whereas with the A6700, it got a lot of those white balance issues correct right in camera without having to do much custom white balancing. But with that said, I would always say you have to custom white balance, especially if you're in a lighting environment like this one, and if you're using a B camera, if you want your colors to match up well, especially if you're shooting in any type of log profiles. That would be step number one, is to make sure that you custom white balance your camera, so that way you're not going into post-production and you're just trying to wrangle with the colors of them not looking right. In my opinion, the A6700 is more of a travel-friendly option. It's lighter, it's smaller, it's sharper, and overall better for stabilization. I've seen a lot of reviews that say the A6700 is weather sealed, but I couldn't find anywhere on Sony's official webpage or B&H Photo that said that. But I did find that the A7C has that. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're shooting in a lot of inclement weather situations, then I would go with the A7C. I also always find it interesting to see who the Sony market research team markets their cameras towards, and in this case, hybrid shooters. But according to the Sony's website, the A6700 was created for creative adventures anytime, anywhere, and the A7C was created for people who demand full frame quality and performance, but also want that compact, lightweight camera. The A6700 has a lot more value at a cheaper cost with cheaper lens options, but make sure to consider if you need a better low light performing camera or easier to get wide shots without that 1.5 times crop. I will be sticking with the A6700 because it's packed with so much value at a great price. I'm Joe with the Film Alliance. Thank you so much for watching this video, and until the next one, have a great week. Oh yeah, also, please let me know in the comment section which one of these two cameras you like better. I'm always interested to hear what you guys like better and why. I laid out the specs and showed you a bunch of comparisons, but now it's your turn to let me know which one you like better. All right, that's it. Have a great week. See you in the next one.